happy again to be here. If you don't know me, my name is Elizabeth. I'm the program director at the J. This is probably my pride and joy, this program. I cry almost every time. I'm going to cry even before Jesse speaks. I just think it's really cool to get all of us in a room to hear these stories. And some of my favorite memories have been when we crowdsourced old names. Or somebody will say, oh yeah, I was related to this person who's my mother-in-law or my mother-in-law's grandmother, and the whole room goes, oh, that's your mother-in-law's grandmother. Like, it's pretty cool. So I do have to thank the Alabama Humanities Alliance, who has granted us the funds to do this program for a year. And I gotta thank Margaret because she jumped on it and she's amazing. I don't know anyone who could do as well in the interviewing portion. My history with Jesse is, so I have a nonprofit background, but never have I been at a company where the board president is so available. And really all our board members are so available. But Jesse would come through the office, and I was, at that time, if you've seen our offices, I had one in the hallway, so we didn't have enough room, so I sat in the hallway, and every time Jesse came through, I was just like, it's the board president, right? And then at the RoHo, when we had an event in RoHo, you spoke with my husband and my son. I was a little busy, but they had nothing but good things to say, and I realized, okay, it's just Jesse, like, which is a wonderful thing, right? Like, and now I do that with Hilton. Oh, gosh.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But anyway, thank you so much. It means a lot for you to be here, and I know it takes a lot to come up here and share stories. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for coming this evening. I'm really excited for our third iteration of Southern Jewish Voices. We've had some great conversations so far, and I know this one's going to be awesome. So, I asked Jesse to do this for several reasons. As Elizabeth said, he's the past president of the JCC board, lifelong member of the Birmingham Jewish community. I also really wanted to bring in somebody with some interfaith context for the month of December. And I know that Jesse is just great at making conversation and would be really good at this. So with all that said, I'm going to jump in. We probably are going to go a few minutes over, just to warn you all, because we're starting a little late. So if anyone needs to sneak out at 7, we won't be totally offended. But I would love if we could start with just some context about your early life here in Birmingham, what it was like to grow up Jewish here. Just give us a little background on sort of your early life.
Yeah. So I was born in Alabama. When I was born, we lived in Pelham, and then moved to Homewood when I was 1. And at that time, very few Jewish families lived outside of Mountain Brook, or a few in Birmingham itself, but mostly in Mountain Brook. So I went to the preschool here at the JCC. So there were a lot of Jewish kids there. I was in playgroup with Jewish kids and things like that. But when I started in kindergarten, I really didn't go to school with Jewish kids. And really, I think it was first grade at Shades Kahaba that I figured out somehow that I was the only Jewish kid in the school. And so that was a really interesting experience to me. And I think of myself kind of in my own context, but also in the context of Jews around the world and the Jewish experience. And to me, and in my life, that realization was kind of a microcosm of the Jewish experience in the diaspora, which is you're living immersed in a society where you are somehow different than everyone, even though as a kindergartner I didn't know I was different than everyone, but it started to kind of emerge. And I think that had a lot of formative impact on my experience and in a lot of ways on my life and on my Jewish identity, because it wasn't just about what I was and what I thought, but it was how I was different within the context of the community that I lived in. And so that was really interesting to me. And I think about that and the difference between being in Homewood schools, where I was at one time the only Jewish kid in my school, but it got a little bit less imbalanced than that, but not much, versus going to Hebrew school and Sunday school, where, of course, it was all Jewish kids, but all kids that went to school together and were friends at their school and not friends with me. And when I was thinking about this interview and kind of this portion of it, one thing that was really interesting to me was thinking about sort of bullying and things like that, or being different, at Homewood, especially in elementary school, I experienced almost no bullying for being Jewish from my peers, but I felt excluded for systematic reasons or institutional reasons. So the Homewood administration would put on Christmas shows or Easter programs that were very much Christian, right? Like you're singing songs about the child savior in your public school. Or there'd be programs that were, and especially by the time I got to middle school, it got really bad, where there would be actual extracurricular activities at school that were explicitly Christian youth groups.
Yeah.
And then they would make us go to assemblies that ended up being advertisements for these Christian youth groups. And I realized that I just had to sit through an hour-long, essentially extended advertisement for a prayer group. But my friends, my peers, never excluded me. A little bit in middle school, the ones that I didn't know as well, who were really deep in those groups and were really internalizing it. But I always had a pack of friends around me who would always have my back, right? Even though it was someone from their experience. But I had kind of the opposite experience in Sunday school and Hebrew school, because that's where I actually got bullied on an individual level from peers and felt excluded from the group of friends because they weren't my friends. They had their friends and they were, very cliquey and very together. And it was a really weird dichotomy on that, where in my peer group I always felt more at home in Homewood, but that institutional kind of exclusion was really happening in Homewood, and Homewood really didn't have a good way of grappling with it at that time. But one thing that this question really triggers about me, and that whole experience always triggered about me, is by that realization at such an early age that I was kind of the outcast, that I was the different one, that my friends were coming back from their Sunday school or whatever, and they were all being told the same thing, and they thought it was true. And I was going to my Sunday school, and I'm being told something different. And then I come back, and I know that we're being taught different things. It didn't make me think, oh, what they're teaching me is right and everyone else is wrong. I think the lesson that it taught me and that I've really taken from it is two things. One, it gave me an affinity or a fraternal kind of feeling towards any marginalized person, right? If you are being marginalized by the group just because of who you are, that could just as easily be me. And so even if I'm not the one being marginalized, I have common cause with marginalized people, always. So that's the one big takeaway. And then the other one was, and this is what would happen in the debates around the lunch table with the kids coming back from Christian prayer groups at school, and this is what they taught us, and this is what hell is, and this is how you don't go there, and all this stuff, that what they were being told, what our teachers were telling us, what their pastors were telling us, but even what my Sunday school teachers were telling me, it's like, just because someone tells it to you doesn't mean it's right. I don't think they're right. Well, how do I know that I'm right? So it added a layer of having to question my own beliefs and even my own lessons, my own life experience, and really be on it. Because if it's going to be the world against me, I better be right. Because it's really hard to win an argument or stand your ground when you are wrong, right? So it not only did it make me question what other people learned themselves, but it also really made me self-examine my own beliefs, and that's kind of continued my whole life. And we were talking before the interview about seeing things that we said years ago, and maybe, I don't know if I'd be okay with that, but that's been my experience my whole life. Like, I thought this 5 years ago. I thought this 10 years ago. Well, that's not me anymore, because constant reexamination, and then maybe, I was wrong back then, or, I didn't know the whole context back then. And that's how I've really pulled a lot of positivity and growth in my life out of that one experience of being kind of the one Jew, Yeah.
It's a fascinating dichotomy. It's sort of interesting because, and I'm curious to see if we can follow this thread a little bit as we go through, but I can see how some of those experiences would have shaped your own Jewish identity, particularly this sort of sense of questioning.
Right.
I can see how that would relate.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it sent me down a journey of kind of trying to figure out what is it that makes someone Jewish, right? And I talk to Christian friends about this a lot because if you're a Christian, in most definitions of that term, the second you stop believing that one thing, you're no longer Christian. But if you're a Jew and you say, oh, I don't study Torah, that's not for me. Oh, I don't keep kosher, that's not for me. Oh, I don't even literally believe in God, that's not for me. Most Jews will tell you don't stop being Jewish just because you stopped professing like the creed or whatever. Like, as long as there's something else that and I've kind of spent years trying to figure out what is that. It's a really hard thing to catch. And to me, a big part of my Jewish experience is being that whatever that is, that I'm in this giant sea of almost homogenous people, but I don't feel homogenous with those people. And that's where it kind of like zoom way out and think about the Jewish experience for the last 2,000 years, when Jews have lived all over the world, and in almost no instances of that entire experience have they ever been the homogenous majority, right? We as a people have always been that kind of odd man out, and within the structures of society that were built without Jews really fitting in it, how does this thing that doesn't fit within our puzzle interact with it? And in a lot of ways, like seeing Jews as an element of society at large, of European society, of American society, of Eastern societies, and having that kind of analogy to that experience here in Alabama, which is a very different experience than Jews have in Williamsburg, than Jews have in some other places. This is a Southern Jewish series. It's like that's a very unique thing, and I think especially so here in the South.
Yeah, and I'm going to be interested when we get to NYU to talk to you.
Oh, yeah.
As someone else who grew up around, you grew up around Jews, but feeling sort of different, growing up around no Jews. I'm kind of curious to talk more about that transition. But I do want to also ask you, and this is sort of in the vein, I guess, of not feeling, homogenous or things that are a little different. Tell me more about your family's interfaith context. And I'm kind of curious, too, because you were talking about working on Christmas.
Yeah.
What were there multiple faiths in your house, or was there really more one faith? Just tell us a little bit more about.
And I kind of feel like you're setting me up a little bit, because we've talked about this a little bit before, and I have a little bit of an issue with the term interfaith, right? Because it implies that there's some sort of theological disagreement between my parents, right? That one of them believes theologically this, and then another one has a different opinion of the divinity, and we are now a family that somehow makes that work. But my whole life, even though my dad, who's sitting right there, never converted to Judaism, I never really felt like my parents were different from a theological perspective, right? I didn't feel like they were of different faiths. Like, I knew my mom was Jewish, and I was raised Jewish, and I knew my dad was not Jewish, and he was not raised Jewish. But there was never this idea of essentially mutually exclusive ideas of philosophy and the divine that had to battle in our house. But we did grow up celebrating some from both traditions. So I actually grew up I was like the kid that got to do Christmas and Hanukkah, and then all the kids got to be jealous. Like, not only are the kids jealous because we have the 8 nights with the presents and everyone gets jealous about presents, but then I also got Christmas on top of that. So I always grew up with both, and it's actually, I think my in-laws really love it that my wife married a Jewish guy, because with all of my other siblings-in-law, they're competing for attention on Christmas, right? So my wife and I every year spend the day before Christmas Eve, Christmas Day exclusively at my in-laws' house. Like, and we stay the night there, and her siblings are at their other in-laws' houses, or they're at their own houses because they want to do Christmas in their house. And so it's almost a gift that I get to give to my parents-in-law, to be there and like let them celebrate this full Christmas, having one of their kids and that set of grandkids and me there for the whole thing. Now I do kind of shirk it a little bit and sit there on my laptop and click through CLEs on Christmas Day, also because the deadline's always a week after Christmas for me to get them done. So it's another lawyer procrastination thing as well. But it helped that my dad was not a very Christmassy Gentile.
Yeah.
And I think I always wondered, and we could talk about it after Dad, but I always wondered if, you talk about love languages and stuff, and the giving and receiving of gifts is like, on my dad registers in the negatives in terms of love languages. And I almost wonder if he met a Jewish girl who doesn't celebrate Christmas and is like, oh, finally, I don't have to do this anymore. I'm so sick of sitting here and like making sure I have the appropriate reaction to getting this Christmas gift today, or get just the right thing, or they spend just the right amount of money, or they're not going to think I love them enough, and they meet this Jewish girl who's never celebrated Christmas in her entire life. And it's like, okay, I can live with this. And so, but that context, it's interesting, and things have changed a lot. But like for my bar mitzvah, my dad wasn't allowed on the bima when I was, he wasn't allowed to be up there for the aliyah. He didn't come up for any part of it. And we had to figure out what my mom's formal Hebrew name was, so that when she could do her aliyah for my bar mitzvah, that they could use that name. It's really funny. My mom grew up in a Jewish family, the granddaughter of immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, and her father was very religious. Her brothers went to Hebrew school, Sunday school, bar mitzvahs, but she didn't go to Hebrew school and Sunday school. It wasn't for the girls.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm sure her brothers knew what their Hebrew names were, but she didn't even know what her Hebrew name was back then. She does now, of course. But I feel like that's even changing a lot. I feel like even our own synagogue has come a very long way. I mean, we're talking,
definitely.
Right, 25 years later. And now, like, I think if my bar mitzvah was tomorrow, my dad would be up there on the bima, and it would be like, how can we integrate you into this service more? But in 1996, it was just like, here's the line, we're going to draw it. My parents are like, yep, all right, that's the rules.
It's amazing that things have changed so much in that amount of time. And thank you, for making your point around interfaith, too. And I know when we were crafting the Inter Everything title, we had some conversations about that, so I think it's a great perspective. I guess one more point of curiosity here, just because you were talking about sort of feeling that sense of difference within your Hebrew school community, which, just to clarify for everyone, is at Bethel, right?
Right, yeah, I grew up in Temple Bethel,
and knowing that things have changed so much with the interfaith dynamics, was that at all part of sort of feeling alienated from the other kids, or not really as much?
The only reason I think that it tangentially was, I don't think the kids cared that my dad wasn't Jewish, or they might not have even known, and if they did, it didn't matter. But all their dads, a lot of their dads grew up Jewish in this town together. So their families were very intertwined.
Interesting. Yeah.
And both of my parents are transplants to Birmingham. And then my dad's not Jewish on top of that. So he wasn't, like, at one time, and it's not really this way anymore, but like a generation or two before me, most of the Jewish people worked for kind of, like, not necessarily one company, but they kind of traveled in clumps, and then the non-Jewish companies didn't have Jews in them, so they were socially connected, they were connected through families, they were professionally connected, and they had these tight networks, and my family was not in that network. Even the Jewish side of my family, came here in the 70s, late 70s, and so it wasn't like the families that go back several generations and they intermarry to each other, and like the number of cousins within my Hebrew school class, or like second cousins and things like this. And we didn't really have, we had my family and my mom's brother's family, and that was the only Jewish family that we had in town. So there was a little bit of that, but it wasn't so much because my parents weren't both Jewish, like, as the cause.
No, that makes so much sense. And and I think is actually kind of important, like the Birmingham and Southern Jewish context. So we're going to leave Birmingham in a minute and go to NYU, but I do want to quickly ask, because I feel like you mentioned it when we were talking beforehand, tell me a little bit about Indian Springs and how that was formative to you.
Oh, yeah. Indian Springs, so, I was having a lot of trouble in middle school, and I mean, it's the perfect topic for this because a lot of the trouble I was having, I'd say like more than 50% of it was with how institutionally Christian the middle school became as compared to my elementary school. And I really was feeling excluded. And again, it wasn't necessarily my friends, especially my elementary school friends that had come up to the middle school. Like, they generally didn't make me feel like an outcast because of my Jewishness. They might have done it because I was like, a dweeby kid or whatever, but not because I was Jewish. But I was really getting down about that, and I was really also understimulated as a result as well. And the middle school environment was kind of like conveyor belt style education, and it's like you're going to be in this class, and then this teacher's going to go through this textbook, and it's like the most bland version of an education you can get. And it got to the point that my grades were suffering, my mental health was suffering just because I wasn't interested in school. The school was becoming very Christian. I didn't feel like I even fit in there anymore. And so I went to Indian Springs starting in 9th grade, and Indian Springs, Indian Springs is a great place if you're the right person and it's the right place for you. And it was the perfect place for me. It was a place with almost no structure. This can be as much work and as hard as you make it, and you need to just figure out how to make it work. And if you want to be on 3 or 4 athletic teams, just coordinate your schedule and you can do it. And if you want to be on 3 or 4 athletic teams and 3 different choirs and be in the play and be on student government all at the same time, which is basically what I did, and I'd be out there until 10:30 every single night. I'd be driving out there on Sundays for rehearsals and stuff. You could do that. So it was an environment that I could really flourish in. It was much more Jewish than any other school I had been in, because it was probably, maybe my class might have been about 20% Jewish, which is like, there's nothing else in Birmingham like that. And it was a mix of Mountain Brook kids and non-Mountain Brook kids. And so it was kind of, and I bet we will get to this again later, but it was kind of the place for the kids that didn't click. There were kind of rich, preppy kids there, but unlike Mountain Brook and Homewood, where they kind of dominated the culture, they were kind of the exception. And if you were really like into math, into science, into history, like didn't mind going to class, really enjoyed all that stuff, like this is the place for you. And you could be a complete idiot on stage and people not like think less of you there, and really embrace that and embrace that uniqueness and that kind of weirdo-ness. So it was perfect for me, and it's not the perfect place for everybody. And I always talk about my brother came in right after me, and then he went back to Homewood because it wasn't the place for him.
Well, that lack of structure, that can really work for some.
Lack of structure
brothers.
Did not work for at school in general, and the structure of that wasn't working for him. But that is a thing. Like it's like you're going to either swim or sink. But if you sink, you go to the bottom. And we're not going to bail you out. Now, my dad might try to bail you out if you're his son and you're starting to sink, but he was also working full time, so that was pretty tough on him too. I think about my dad staying up with my brother late at night doing projects that he forgot about until the day before they were due, and think about my own work life right now. And if I had to stay up all night and do a project for my kids and then get up and go to work the whole day the next day, that would have been rough.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's great that it was such a good fit for you,
Yeah.
and it sounds like it was just, sort of the perfect place for you to be in that moment. So I'm curious then, from there, why NYU? And tell me a little bit about that transition. And, as part of that, I am curious, what was it like to be all of a sudden at a school that is obviously very Jewish in a city that's very Jewish?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there. So the main reason I went to NYU is because I wanted to act. And I was going to be a performer, and if you wanted to act, in my mind, you needed to be in New York. Going to act at, the University of Alabama seemed like this kind of pretend whatever. If you were really going to make it and really do real acting, you had to be in New York, and you had to be at NYU. That's just what I thought. And so that was the thing that really drove me to go to NYU more than anything else. And then coincidentally, it happens to be this place where an inordinate number of my fellow students were Jewish as well. But it's the kind of thing where, and this is very different than the experience that you get in Birmingham. It's a Jewish place because it has a lot of Jews, but it's not Jewish because it's Jewish on purpose. And so, I was more involved in Hillel at the University of Virginia, where I went to law school, than I wasn't involved in Hillel at all at NYU. I wasn't involved in Jewish student groups at all. But 2 of my 4 roommates one year were Jewish, and my first year roommate was a different person, and he was Jewish. I lived with all these Jews. At NYU, people they thought I was lying. I would say
About being Jewish?
About being Jewish.
Okay.
They go, I'm Jewish, and I go, yeah, I'm Jewish too, and they'd be like, no, listen, Alabama boy with your blonde hair, and no, you're not. And I'm like, what? You want me to start singing my Haftorah from my bar mitzvah? What's it gonna take for me to convince you that the first person you've ever met from Alabama is actually Jewish too? And some of my Jewish friends up there were the stereotypes of Jews, right? And they were the hardest ones to convince.
Yeah.
But that was very interesting, being kind of the Jewish one, and a joke amongst my friends that I was the Jewish one, right? I was in a play, Jesus Christ Superstar, down here at it was actually at John Carroll during the summer before I went to college, and there's a line in that play where the Jesus character is singing to all these zealots and everything, and the line goes, neither you nor the Romans nor the Jews can do something, something, something. And the joke was that he would say, neither you nor the Romans nor the Jew, and he would point at me because I was the one Jew, right? And then to be people don't even think I'm Jewish up in New York.
Yeah.
But also being in New York, I was much more proximate to my Jewish family, because my mom's extended family was still all in Long Island and Manhattan. So I was getting what I saw as the authentic New York Jewish experience, which was going out to Roslyn or those places in Long Island for holidays and stuff like that. And they are full on New York, Long Island Jews, screaming at each other all the time, talking over each other. And to me, that was just stress, right? Being at my mom's cousins' houses or her friends' houses, and my whole life, that was just a stressful situation. That was a speed that I didn't have. And it's something that, my wife and I actually have a little bit of a conflict over this, because one of her favorite shows is Seinfeld. But that's a show that I could never really get into because they are so much... Jerry Seinfeld is from Massapequa, which is 2 towns over from the town my mom grew up in. When I'm watching that show, I'm sitting at my mom's cousin's house in Roslyn with all these loud, like, kind of mean Jews yelling at each other and complaining over nitpicky stuff, and I don't see funny, I see anxiety, right? So that show comes on, and people are like, this is the funniest show, and I'm like, this show is like the most triggering show for me, because it just reminds me of those times. And we'd be down in South Florida, where everyone, all the Jews from up there are down in South Florida over Christmas time, where we'd spend a lot of that part of the year. And, we'd be at mom's cousins or friend's house, and they'd be having a screaming argument, even though there were 20 people in this house, and my dad would be like, we're going to go take a walk around the block, because, we had to remove ourselves from the situation. So what's interesting about all that is, maybe I was fish out of water at Shades Cobb Elementary School. I'm also a little bit fish out of water in very, traditional and homogenous Jewish communities. Yeah, definitely. It kind of goes back to that, inter-whatever family dynamic. But even still, I have Jewish cousins here in town, and that was a more comfortable dynamic that I was used to growing up into. And then all of our cousins in New York, it's like, why is it that my stress level is now at 95%? But that was a big change. But New York is interesting, and the funny thing is, yes, I had a lot of Jewish friends at NYU, and we were all kind of the same thing. We were Jewish millennials. We were overeducated, and we were still in the process of becoming overeducated even more so. We came from all over the country, and we were in the one city in the United States that really is the melting pot. We think the United States is a melting pot. Mm-hmm. It's really not. But the area around New York is where the real melting pot is. And we were really immersing ourselves in that kind of multiculturalism of New York. It's been the last 10 years of going back to New York that I've really touched and dug into the Jewish roots of New York, and really gone deep into the Lower East Side and going to the Tenement Museum every time I go up there and exploring different parts of them and seeing that experience that was really my great-grandparents' experience of New York City. And so that Jewish connection to New York, to me, interestingly, I had to leave New York. Katz's Deli became my favorite restaurant in New York 2 years after I graduated from NYU. I never ate there once when I was actually at NYU and actually lived in New York. But now, every time I go back there, it's really that connection to the Jewish thing that I feel in a new and very different way.
Yeah, I totally get that, actually. I feel like I relate to that.
Yeah.
Kind of 100%.
Right.
And it's interesting, one other thing I do want to highlight that you said that I think is so interesting and something I've thought about is this difference, too, between being somewhere like Birmingham or UVA, where, Jewish is not like the waters you swim in, and so in some ways you kind of have to participate in Judaism to feel like you're connecting, whereas somewhere like New York, even if you're doing nothing Jewish, you can still kind of feel plugged in a different way. So I think that's such an interesting dynamic that you hit on.
It's funny because my mom went to what you could call a Jewish high school because it was overwhelmingly majority Jewish, but it was public school in the North Shore of Long Island. It just happened to be that 90-something% of the people that lived in that school district, that's where the Jews moved. The Jews that had a little money in their pocket, from the previous generation. And the summer camps that my mom went to were Jewish summer camps because every single person there was Jewish, not necessarily because it wasn't like when I went to Jewish summer camp and it's like, this is Camp Ramah, you come here and we're going to keep kosher and we're going to you're not allowed to use a towel when you swim on Saturday because somehow that breaks the Shabbos rules, but the other thing, the great arbitrariness of the application of Jewish rules. You can eat, we're going to have milk at breakfast and then lunch is going to be a half hour later today so we have a long enough period of time between the dairy meal and my mom went to a Jewish summer camp that probably had none of those rules, but every single person there was Jewish.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of de facto Jewish, but not by design.
Yeah.
Whereas what I was going to were these camps by design, and that is a very different experience. And that kind of de facto Jewishness is what I would experience when I went to visit her family, or when we're in South Florida, right? Like when my grandparents moved to South Florida and ultimately lived there full time, they lived in a subdivision that had 4 golf courses and all this other stuff, and it wasn't a Jewish place, but it was a Jewish place. Everybody there was Jewish. And, the clubhouse is open on Christmas Day because none of the people that lived there had plans on Christmas and they had to eat something. And so it was kind of nice to be down there on Christmas because there was stuff going on.
Yeah.
When I was up here on Christmas, I don't know how many times I did it, but I've definitely at least 4 times pre-celiac disease eaten at a Waffle House on Christmas Day by myself because I would just have the whole day.
Yeah.
And nothing was open.
Yeah, that's pretty much the only one.
Now we got, I don't want to say the place I go on Christmas Day because I'm worried it'll get too crowded, but it's a Chinese place and it's great.
Oh, we won't make you reveal your secrets.
Yeah.
So this is not a Jewish question necessarily,
Okay.
but I do want to hit on it, which is, you said you were interested in going to NYU, for acting. I know we were talking earlier and you said you were in College of Arts and Science. So tell me a little bit more about what you studied, your theater journey, all of that.
So I was I wanted to be an actor and I didn't really have a backup plan. But I was also, and I think, maybe to jump ahead a little bit, too risk averse to really just go full on dive headfirst into a theater program.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be in New York and I wanted to be at NYU, but instead of going into either, there's at least 2, if not 3 different colleges at NYU that have theater performance courses of study in them, and I didn't go to any of those. I went to the regular College of Arts and Sciences to get just a normal BA, and because I didn't really have a backup plan, and because it's what I was good at in high school, and because it's what my dad did, I thought I was going to be a math major.
Okay.
And then I signed up for a math class, realized it was the exact same math class with the same textbook that I had taken my senior year of high school, dropped that class, couldn't get them to exempt me from it for a year. I picked up a music theory class and became a music major, and ended up majoring in music. But over my time at NYU, I basically found the tiny little gaps in the systems of the other schools and in theater to work my way into performances within other schools. So my freshman year, I auditioned for an improv show that was actually in the Tisch School of Fine Arts. And I got in to this show, and I was the only non-Tisch person in that show. And I did that for the rest of my time up there, and we went to the Chicago Improv Festival, and that was a great experience for me. And then I learned that the School of Education that had a theater performance, theater education and performance major cross-listed a lot of classes with the College of Arts and Sciences, and some of them were just straight-up acting classes. So I took 2 acting classes, actually 3 acting classes, what they call dramatic literature, which is just reading a lot of Shakespeare plays and talking about them. And then through that, started auditioning for a School of Education plays and getting pretty serious roles in these plays. So these are my off Broadway resume credits. But that's what I wanted to do, and then I graduated, and I was planning on living up there and trying to make it while I did what my backup plan was, which was to take the LSAT. And then realized it was going to be, the risk of not being able to eat or afford my rent, and it only took 1 conversation with my dad before I'm like, all right, I'm coming back home, and I'm going to live at your house while I study for the LSAT, and I think part of it is that risk aversion. I was once told by one of my law school classmates that lawyers are the really smart people who are too risk averse to go into business. And it's one of those things that you're like, oh, get out of the inside of me, because that cut a little bit too close to home. And I think that kind of is such a large element of my personality that it's kind of why I ended up on the path that I did. But I feel like I'm the most full expression of myself in that kind of way when I'm performing, more so than when I'm sitting in my office and writing documents for people. It's really funny that I'm someone that reads people's documents and writes them for them now, because reading and writing were my least favorite things to do. And now that's what I do for my job. And there is a performative aspect to my job, and there's certainly an improvisational aspect to my job. And so I've kind of worked it in. But that's really why I wanted to be in New York. That's really kind of where I really shine the most, I feel like.
Yeah, that's a hard path. Obviously, I think it probably takes some starving and not being able to afford your rent.
Right.
So
Yes.
yeah, that makes sense, and I can understand why you would take a different path too. But I guess one thing I'm curious about is, so I know you came back and you did go to UVA at some point. Did you have the intention of coming back to Birmingham, or is that something that sort of happened by happenstance?
It was more happenstance. It was more, and it might even be risk aversion again. I went to Virginia for law school. That was the law school I wanted to go to. I'd lived in New York. I didn't want to live and work in New York again, especially if I was going to be doing law. It seemed miserable to live in New York and work for a law firm. I wanted to go to a law school that was in the South. I don't really care for the kind of, I don't even know how to put a word on it, but the Ivy League kind of, whatever that is, like the label. I'm not a labels guy. So if something has a really big label on it, I don't want it, right? So even if it's the best, if it's like a brand name of the best, I'm like, I want to find the one that's not the brand name, that's just as good, right? And so UVA to me at that time of my life was like the place. And when I got into UVA and they offered me a little bit of scholarship money, I started calling up schools and saying, like, take my resume. Either I'm not doing it, or you can just drop my application, or you can take me off the list, or whatever. I called up. I sent an email to Harvard Law School and was like, hey, I know that you said that you're not going to respond until next month. Don't even bother. Because it's like, I'm going to UVA. I'm not going to Harvard. I want to go here. Yeah. So I wanted to go to a law school that was in the South. I don't know why, really. I think I had a reason then. I knew Birmingham was out there, but I found myself in this job. When I was going to law school and I wanted to be an actor, but I was going to law school, it's like, well, with a law degree, you can do a lot of things. Well, I didn't really pursue what a lot of those things were. And law firms interviewed on campus. You just went on and clicked on the law firms you want to interview. You got your application automatically submitted. I clicked on every single Birmingham firm that was interviewing on campus. I'd never heard of the law firm that I've now worked at for 13 years. And so it was a little bit of the inertia of the whole process that made me kind of land where I am now. There wasn't a really big master plan to it all. But the inertia of Birmingham is also really hard to fight, I feel like. There's a big, and especially I feel even more now that I have kids, and to have my family so close, and to have my network so close, and to have the network of Birmingham so close, like to have all the amenities of big cities, but have it all be so close, and let me do national, international, big firm work, and still have a 7-minute commute, and still live in walkable neighborhoods, and still have the cultural things. I was talking to a client today who lives in another kind of medium to large city, and for them to go downtown to see a show or something is a big deal.
Yeah.
But for us to go downtown, to go to the Alabama Theater, that's less than a 10-minute drive, and you're in your parking spot, and you're walking right there. So there is a pull to Birmingham that's really intangible, really hard to describe, that it has its gravity, that is a much stronger pull than I think a lot of people expect.
Yeah, definitely. And, having family here, too, obviously a huge plus, which does kind of bring me, I want to ask you about meeting your wife, Anna, who I know is here. Right.
Although she just walked out the door.
Should I hold that question? I
don't know. She'll be fine. Okay. She knows this story.
She can watch the recording.
Yeah, she can watch the recording later. I'd moved back to Birmingham in 2008, and I was single for we met at the end of 2011, I believe. Anna is the expert on chronology and dates.
Well, she's not in the room right now.
She's not in the room right now. I know. I was going to look her, and she was going to tell me the real date. But I don't know if it's still this way, but being single in Birmingham was really tough, and especially if you weren't a member of a church, because that's where people
Yeah.
went to meet other singles. They'd join a church,
Actually, yeah.
right? Why don't you just find a church group to go, and sign up for a Bible study? It's like, well, that's not happening. And this was just before, online dating really lost the kind of taboo that it used to have, and things like that. So it was very difficult to meet people. So I actually met Anna because she was a friend of my uncle's stepdaughter at the University of Alabama.
Okay.
My step cousin, set us up, and they were both majorettes at Alabama. They're called Crimsonettes, and we met. Formally were introduced to each other. It's easy for me to remember what game it was. It was the Arkansas game, because we met at the tailgate on the quad, falling over distance from Denny Chimes, and the tailgate I was at, and why it's so easy to remember, they had smoked a whole hog, right? Sorry, Jewish interview, and those of you watching at home. I don't think I ate any of it, or maybe I did. Who knows? Who can remember that far back? But I literally was introduced to Anna and could take 3 steps to the right and put my hand on the head, because it was whole, right?
Yeah,
face and everything.
I can picture it.
So I can remember this pig being, right next to us, and they were doing a whole hog because Arkansas is the Razorbacks,
Yeah.
right? For the Florida game, they had fried alligator. For this one, they had a whole hog. So it's always easy for me to remember what game we met at. And so, I'd been not having very much success dating in Birmingham before that. And Anna, I almost wonder if she had an experience similar to my dad's experience, because I don't know if I was the first Jewish person she had ever met, but she certainly hadn't met many, and she's from a fairly small town in West Alabama where there is, actually I do think there's one Jewish family there.
Okay.
And we don't need to speculate what their job is in that town, but it is one of the jobs that you would probably speculate that they do. I almost wonder if she, kind of like my dad, had that kind of deep kind of not fitting with that very Southern Protestant society, and when she met someone like me, and she was a big Seinfeld fan already, of course, but met a Jewish guy who was very different than all the guys that she grew up with and all the guys that she went to college with and all these people, if that was really appealing for her. And it's the same kind of interfaith thing. I really don't feel like Anna and I have a theological conflict.
Yeah.
I don't feel like we both live and share a life together where we have theological beliefs that we're just we'll agree to disagree. We don't talk about those things very much, but we both, the theology of it all and the you believe this literally is true part of the theology of it all isn't so much an important thing for either of us, for our identities and stuff. So we always got along. It's one of those things where just, this will be good advice for the archives. Mm-hmm. The best advice I ever got, and it was right after I'd had a really bad breakup, and one of my mentors at work, after I'd had that really bad breakup, and he'd, kind of followed me along this whole relationship, he said, the thing about a relationship is it's supposed to be easy. If it's not easy, it's not healthy. And none of my relationships before that had been easy. They'd been drama. They'd been roller coasters. They'd been I better not say this way, or she's going to think that of me. And by the time I met Anna, I had really internalized that, and it was easy. It was I'm just going to be myself. I'm going to say what I think. If she doesn't want to return my phone calls, that's whatever. And it just from day one was and when Anna and I started dating, our first date was 2 months before I got diagnosed with celiac disease. Mm. So I was incredibly sick.
Yeah.
The second month we were dating, I lost 20-something pounds.
Oh, wow.
I was so sick, and I would be at home, laying in bed at night, just in pain and suffering there, and knowing that I had a date coming up with this girl, and thinking, I can't be in a relationship right now. Like, I just am not well enough to be in a relationship. I've got to break up with this girl. It's not fair to her. I can't do it. And it was, when I'd be with her, it was just so easy. It didn't add any burden to the burden that I was already feeling. And over time, it was like, and we moved kind of fast. We moved in together pretty early. She was like in a weird up-in-the-air housing situation. It's like, well, let's not delay anymore. Let's just go ahead and do this. But it was like the first relationship where it's like, oh, you actually make my life easier, not harder. Like when you're around, it doesn't get any, like even when life is hard, you're not even triggering the hard parts of it.
I hope she's back in the room and hearing.
No, she's gonna have to watch this one on the video.
We'll show her the recording.
Yeah. It might be easier because she's not in the room.
That's very sweet though, and it's really cool to hear more about how you all met and that dynamic, and to hear, I think, again, that sort of dynamic around. And we can get away from the word interfaith, but a similar dynamic in some ways to what you grew up with. I'm curious, like, because you have 2 young children, has having kids like changed at all, like conversations you have around religion and identity and things like that?
A little bit, it does, but it's sort of like maybe the rest of my life where we're not going into it with too much of a plan. And so, I read a lot and whatever. I don't memorize a lot, but there's one poem, a very famous one, that I've memorized a piece of that around the time that I started dating Anna and then through this and with the kids. It's from Robert Burns' poem that the title, the John Steinbeck book of Mice and Men, comes from. And it's the line is that line, and it's in Old Scottish, so the line goes, and Mousie, thou art know thy lane, for thinking foresight may be vain, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glee, and leave us not but grief and pain for promised joy. In other words, don't overplan your future, because if you overplan your future, you're just going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
Like, the world is too complicated for your little storybook plans. And the worst depressions I've had in my life, the worst crises of my life has been when I have created a fairy tale version of my future and then had to sit there while it all came apart and realizing that and then grieving over that future that I'd already built in my head. And by the time I met Anna and was dating her, I quit I'll plan, we're going to go do this in the future. Yeah, this in the future, but I'm not planning our wedding on day one. I'm not planning, we're going to live this life, we're going to do these things. And so that became a governing philosophy of my life. And so even with the kids, and it turns out, we have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and our 4-year-old special needs and nonverbal. Like, the more we planned for the future of this child before she was born, the more disappointment we would feel as she wasn't fitting within that. And the more that we said, this is the world, this is what's throwing at us, what's today, let's keep working towards today and figure out tomorrow as it comes, the less you have to grieve over this future that you had already kind of constructed. And it's kind of that way with the religion, and we're kind of playing it as we go. The kids, pre-COVID, my mom was taking my now 4-year-old to synagogue almost every week.
Yeah.
And so she was growing up in a synagogue, going more than I went as a 1, 2, 3-year-old. But she's nonverbal. She doesn't necessarily know what Jewish is and Christian is. And then when they're up in Fayette and Anna's mom wants to take them to church, and I've been to that church a couple of times, and I'm not okay with it, like with what is said specifically. Like, the building's fine, the people are fine, but like what is preached, and it's like, because not only do I disagree with it, but some specific things I think are toxic ideas to plant in people's brains that cause problems. And we've had discussions about that. Now, her mom's like does the kindergarten preschool, which is more babysitting than like stuff. And so it's like, well, while it's still that, it's that. But if they start talking about LGBT people and what they think about that, which this preacher at this church did during a wedding that I went to at that. It might be one of the 2 services I've been through, and he decided that was the perfect opportunity to give his thoughts on gay marriage. And I thought it was wildly inappropriate, and I also, of course, disagreed with the sentiment. That's a big deal. And Anna's had to grapple with growing up in that culture and her own feelings towards it. But it's something that, because of the nature of our relationship, it's a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. It's not like, let's draw the battle lines, and this is where I am, and this is where you are, and this is a debate about what the rest of our future is going to be. It's, hey, my mom wants to take the kids to church on Sunday. It's like, well, your mom takes them to synagogue. Well, that's true. It's like, well, the real reason my mom wants to take her to church is to show her off to all her friends.
Yeah.
Like, that's where you see people in Fayette. And it's like, okay, like, I have to, like, kind of get out of myself and go, yeah, I need to let them do that. It's their grandkids too, you know?
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like, and this is, very interesting with all of it. If my kids grew up and became Christians, that would break my heart. Like, if they, identified as Christian, if they became saved or accepted Jesus, I don't know if I would be able to deal with that.
Yeah.
I would really struggle with that.
That's interesting. Although, like you said, and I think this is wise advice, it's, impossible to know what's going to happen. So I appreciate that sort of mentality of taking it as it comes. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And I think that one thing that highlights is that it is just not as simple as one faith, 2 faiths. This is like a whole mix of things going on. This is not a totally clean transition, but I do want to make sure we get to this. Okay. Which is, I want to hear from you a little bit as sort of the last part of our interview about getting involved in Jewish communal life, and of course, particularly at the J. But given our earlier conversation now, I think I'm particularly curious about that, given that you did feel kind of not totally fitting in with the Jewish community when you grew up here, and now you're obviously very involved. So tell me more about that.
It's really interesting that I ended up doing all this stuff. Yeah. And I think it says something interesting about just my personality and who I am. And how I find when I'm put in a situation, what does my personality do? To end up the president of the JCC board, you might think that I was gunning to be on this board and gunning to take it over for a long time. The reason I joined the JCC board, I was a first or second year associate at Birmingham. A past president of the JCC was a senior partner at the law firm. He called me up and he said, hey, do you want to be on the board of the JCC? And I thought, well, you better not say no to a senior partner. And I'm supposed to be doing business development and community stuff, so this seems like that. So yeah, whatever, I'll do that. And so I said yes. Now the JCC was an important place to me when, not only did I grow up at the preschool, at the day camp, I was a CIT at the day camp. When I really, after I got very sick my junior year of high school, and then when I was getting back in shape, and then got in really good shape in college and even law school, whenever I was home, I was at the gym here every day. When I studied for the bar exam, I studied by the pool. I'd take my book by the pool when I couldn't stand it anymore. And by it, I mean studying for the bar exam. I'd either get in the pool or come in here and work out. It's a great way to get in shape. That's the opposite of the shape I'm in now. But I'd spent a lot of time at this place. So it wasn't like a completely random thing. But I didn't really have any interest in being on the board. Not really. And at that time, there were 55, 60 people on the board. Maybe 20 would show up to a meeting. I would show up maybe once every 3 months. I had no idea what they were talking about. I didn't know why the president seemed so stressed out every time in these meetings. And I didn't even really know what was going on. But I'm like a doer by nature. And and I'm very principled when I'm a doer, and I was in that kind of pattern, and Betsy Lynch, who was the executive director at the time, and Alyssa Nadler, who was the president at the time, said, we need to fix this board. We need to change this board structure and make it into a functioning board. We need to put together a governance committee, and you're a lawyer, so we want you to chair the governance committee for that. And so my job became rewriting the bylaws. This was 8 years ago, probably. So we went from 55 board members to 38 board members to 28 board members to 20, and now we're down to 18. We rewrote the bylaws like 5 different times to get from a massive, non-functional thing into something that could actually do the job that it's supposed to do. And sort of like in my law firm job, it's like once you give me this task, and especially since it's about structure and it's about how this institution operates, like I'm going to like really figure it out and then get all in. And, you know, all of our boards had kind of been running on this inertia for decades, and they'd kind of found themselves in this place where they were still there, but the institutions were all suffering because these structures, just like they're just tools, right? Your board structure, your management structure, those are really tools to accomplish goals. And just like any tools, if they're not maintained and if they're not used appropriately, they're useless, right? And so when you had a 55-member board with 20 people showing up to meetings and not the same 20 people every month, that tool wasn't doing anything.
Yeah.
And the finances were falling apart. I mean, everything was falling apart. And it wasn't just the JCC, it was a lot of the other boards too. And so once I really started to wrap my mind around that problem and was like, okay, if all of our goals is to make these tools work again, and then to apply those tools to make these organizations function to do outcomes that we want, let's do that, right? And once in my mind I was like, let's do that, stuff that wasn't working became very frustrating, right? And so the J board, we were starting to do that, and that's when I really got plugged in. Like, that's when I really became a plugged-in board member.
Yeah.
And the next-gen stuff, the next-gen wasn't us going, hey, I got a great idea for a strategic plan. Let's, like, do this. I've got an idea for how everything's going to work. Next-gen came up because me and Robert Bromberg had gone to a big community meeting, and it's like, it feels like nothing's happening. They're talking about fixing all this stuff, but I don't see any movement in fixing this stuff, and I am frustrated. Like, why am I coming to these meetings? And she was a doer too. And it's like, okay, if people really want to fix this, this is like the curse of being a lawyer. You're fixing everybody else's problems for them, right? If people really want to fix these things, like, let's just start doing it. You just, okay, we'll set up a new structure. We'll have that new structure function the way that, you know, committees aren't something that we invented. Committee structures exist everywhere, and when they're applied correctly, they can actually do things. So let's put together a committee and then kind of go like, this is how you run a stakeholder process and get input, and then move the ball down the field. And then so that evolved into the next gen, which is a name, by the way, that I hate. We should have come up with a name of our own, because that was a name that was given to us, and it's a name that I hate because I'm turning 40 in less than 6 months. Like, when am I in this generation? Right? Is it going to be when I'm 70? Is that when it's my turn? And all of us, right? We've got kids and stuff. Like, aren't they the next gen? Like, what are they? Like, they're future gen. But we came up with a proposal, and we came up with a roadmap. But I think in a lot of ways, the proposal and the roadmap have been misinterpreted, because we didn't, or at least in my opinion, I can't speak for everyone, but the answers and the structures in the roadmap weren't supposed to be the end. The roadmap was supposed to be, look, this is how we start a conversation, and then use a conversation to move ourselves down the field to hopefully ultimately accomplish goals. So the roadmap was evidence of a process that could move that conversation to there, and then it was a milestone. Boom. At this point in the conversation, we've talked from where we were to this thing. So here's this structure in here, and here's all these principles, and here's all these missions. But now, this isn't the end of the conversation and implement it. This is, let's broaden the group. Let's push it out beyond this. And I think that in the community, when we look back to the roadmap, we look at it the wrong way sometimes. How do we set up the structure like it says in the back of the roadmap? My name's at the top of the roadmap. I went around to every organization, presented to them. How close you get to that structure, I don't care, right? The structure wasn't important.
Yeah.
What was important was the way we set up the Next Gen Committee, which again, I hate that name, but I'm still going to call it that.
We're
We're going to keep using Interfaith and Next Gen for now.
We're ditching interfaith a little bit.
We're at that time, there was about 30 people under the age of 40 spread out across the boards of these organizations. We were all feeling the same frustration.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it feels like we're just doing the same thing and hoping for something better to happen. It's the, let's pull this into like a little Jewish whatever. It feels like we're waiting for the Messiah, right? But unlike Christians, I don't think, this might piss people off, for the archives. I don't think the Messiah is just some guy that comes in and solves all of our problems. The quest for the Messiah is, how do you work to make the world the perfect world that you want it to be? You have to build the world, right? It was, I think it's Maimonides. It was either Maimonides or Baruch Spinoza who said, the Messiah will come, but he may tarry, right? Like, I'm certain, but he might not, right?
Yeah.
In other words, don't sit around waiting for someone to come up. Like, he might wait. He might wait forever. You need to work on this world now. So we got all the young people, all of them. And then we said, okay, you're all in the room. Let's winnow this down to a working group. So you're all going to have a voice in this. Get that working group together. That working group's going to come back to this larger group. But this is how we facilitate a conversation. We're not coming in with a solution and telling you, this is how I'm going to cram it down to you. This is how we go from the bottom up and facilitate the conversation. Because if we're talking about community, community isn't a king that tells everybody how to live. Community is all the people learning what it is that brings them together. So we need to bring all of us into this conversation. And so that became kind of the core of the movement of that.
Yeah.
And what we would say is, this is a solution, this organizational structure, all this stuff is a solution that we came up with in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Right? Here's a theoretical structure that's a great thing to talk about. But now what we're going to do is, these organizations are real. The people that work in these things, the people that are on the boards, the people that are the stakeholders of these organizations, they are particular individuals with particular opinions. They're not theoretical people. This is not an economics textbook, right? Mm-hmm. Now we start seeing, okay, experiment. Can you two come together? Okay, that might not have worked. Now, the measure of success is not how close can we get to, no, let's cram you together to make it match the structure we put together. The measure of success is, now that we have new facts, sort of like looking back at my old conversations and going,
yeah.
I don't think that anymore. Now that I have new facts, did my old solution still apply, or did I learn something and now we need to change course? And so that was the idea of the roadmap. That was, for me at least, and that was the idea of this entire movement about it. And I think that in the years since then, and then I became president of the J, and we hired new people, and a lot of stuff has changed. But drove some fire into all of this stuff. And I think a lot of stuff has changed, and some people think certain aspects are good, some people think certain aspects are negative. I personally think certain aspects are good and negative. I think there's a lot of people that think a lot of different things. But what's undeniable is that a lot of these organizations, or in fact most of them, that were a part of that process, even though they don't look like the roadmap today, and maybe they will one day, I don't know, but the way that they talk about change and the way that they've implemented their evolution over that time, and particularly at the J, where I was the most involved in the kind of years after the roadmap, I mean, this is a completely different place today than it was 4 years ago. And it wasn't because we just came up with a solution that worked. It's because we found an entirely new dynamic for management. And the board, an 18-person board where everybody's plugged in. So there might be more than 18. No, there's 18 people on the board, and at any given board meeting, you'll have 14 or 15 of them there. I mean, a board that is there, and they're up to speed on what's going on, and they know what's going on. And then that board's main job, the main job of any of our nonprofit boards, is hiring a senior management person. Call them what you want, executive director, CEO, whatever. That's not a lifetime appointment. They're not Supreme Court justices, and it's a good thing they're not, right? A board can be responsive to that and manage that, and not just go, well, this person's been in this job for this long, they're just going to be in it no matter what's happening on the books, no matter what's happening with the organization. And you know, where we've gotten the JCC and the management culture, I think that this evolution has gotten us to, and where we are today, 80 degrees, December 8th, 2022. I had to throw the temperature in there for the archives.
It's really warm
It's
out
really
there.
bizarre. It's the perfect Southern conversation about a mid-December day and in the 80s. You know, we've had a lot of changes at the at the highest level of management, but even in the lower levels of management. And people who have not been plugged into this process and have not been plugged into how this dynamic now works might see, you know, we had Betsy, then we had Richard, and then during Richard was when we really started to push this change. And then we had Sam for a year. Mm-hmm. We had Amy for a year and a half, I believe. Now we have Brooke. And I think a lot of people might see that. It's like, you can't retain a CEO. You just got too much turnover. When in fact, where we are right now is with a management structure that can assess who's the right fit at the right time for that job. Okay, that person was the right fit for this job at this time. Are they the right fit for that job now? Maybe not, right? Just because your answer was the right answer 18 months ago, when the facts change, maybe things change.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear, you know, your thoughts on all of these things, and, you know, particularly, you know, it's fascinating to hear about the J structure, and I think the way that you explained the roadmap in particular, I've never quite heard it explained that way, so I could keep talking to you about this all evening, but I know we're coming to the end of our time, so I do want to give you a chance to sort of give us a note to end on, you know, something that you want to say to kind of wrap up our conversation, or something you feel like I haven't asked you yet that you want to get out there.
Interesting. All right, it's just on the spot.
Okay.
It's like maybe a message to my Jewish community.
Yeah.
In the world that we're living in right now, where, and we're all feeling it. You know, it's December 2022 right now, and the world that we all lived in our whole lives, I mean, the world, the whole globe is coming apart at the seams, and we have lived, and our parents' generation especially, but us too, our whole lives in this unique time in world history where the world and human society has actually been radically different than it was for 10,000 years, ever. Like, human beings have never lived this way before, right? I mean, like, look at all this, right? because we've been fully immersed in it our whole lives, it feels like it's normal, and that's just the way things are. But we're watching in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in East Asia, in Europe, that thing that we've thought is normal is starting to come apart. And as that's happening, this anti-Semitism, real anti-Semitism, right? Real anti-Semitism is coming back to the surface. It was always there. It was always ready to be there. Read, I don't know, I'm giving everyone a reading assignment. None of you are going to read it. It's Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. Is an amazing book. And it's a book that describes the totalitarian institutions that developed in the 20th century. It's in 3 parts. Well, this might surprise you if you've never picked up that book. Part 1 of that book is called Anti-Semitism. That's what it's about. And it talks about why the Jews, right? In Nazi Germany, why the Jews, right? She starts off the book with a joke. There's this old joke that says, 2 Germans talking, it's source of all of our problems is all these Jews. And the other one goes, yeah, the Jews and the bicyclists. And the guy goes, well, why the bicyclists? And the other one goes, well, why the Jews? Right? But she says that joke actually is not correct because it implies that the Nazis could have just as easily gone after the bicyclists and made them the target.
Yeah.
And done everything they did with the bicyclists being the bad guy and them leading a Holocaust against the bicyclists. But that whole first part is about how the Jews were not a random choice. Within the context of Europe and that ideology in that moment in time and in our society, it could only be the Jews that filled that role within the way the world thought about them. And that role is still out there, and the world's anti-Semitism can come back in a real and scary way that we know people who lived through it. We have some living memory of the echoes of it, but as time goes on, that living memory gets farther and farther away, and we're seeing it come in a real way again. And I think the message is, as Jews, sort of like we're saying about the interfaith stuff, that we're not in a box.
Yeah.
Just because you're a Jew doesn't mean anything specific. I don't know anything about a person. If you tell me this person is something and they're a Jew, I don't know anything about them. Right?
Yeah.
Because that person is an individual. Jews represent the entire spectrum of the human experience. But as Jews, because in society, that ability for us to become the target, and in a very dangerous and scary way is there, we need to be more accepting, I think, of each other.
Yeah.
And we need to, and we were talking about this earlier, we need to really understand that even though we're all Jews, and even though we represent the entire spectrum of humanity, liberal, conservative, spendthrifts and penny pinchers and people that spend too much, and up and down, left and right, everything you want, super risk averse people and risk takers, like all of it. We need to, I think, realize that we are all family. We all need to do a better job of understanding each other, respecting that we're different, respecting that we might have different opinions about things. But if we don't do that and we're all out for ourselves, the world is going to gang up on us again and we will have nothing left.
Yeah,
right?
I really like that sentiment. And I appreciate your willingness to end on sort of a sincere and serious note too. And I think what I've really enjoyed about this conversation is I feel like we've laughed, we've gotten into some really serious stuff as well. So I just want to say thank you so much for being so open and willing to share with us all. And we all give them a round of applause.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you for coming.